All right, you guys ready? Please put your hands together for our opening keynote, the most wonderful, most exceptional Tarana Burke.
Oh, this is what 5,000 people in the room looks like. Hello, good morning. They didn't teach me how to say that in German. How do I say that? Farfenugen. You're gonna hear that joke from stupid Americans all day. Anyway, how many people saw my name on the list and said, why is she here? You can be honest. Yeah? Somebody looked and said, it had to have crossed a few of your minds when you saw my name, like, oh God, we have to talk about that thing again? At least in America, people are tired of, I hear it all the time, I'm so tired of Me Too. I'm so tired of talking about this. Well, I can give you 3 guesses about why I'm here. 1, the theme is diversity, and you can't have a conference on diversity without actually having a little diversity. And they got 2 for 1 with me, right? 2, I represent a global movement that's changing the way we talk about things like gender equity and corporate culture and sexual violence, among, of course, everywhere from communities to corporate headquarters. Or 3, I founded something small with a big idea, and with tenacity, integrity, vision, and grace, I've watched it grow into a big thing with a small idea. So, I hope you guessed by now that it's 3 for 3. Y'all gonna have to laugh at my jokes now. I worked hard on these jokes. Thank you, give me a chuckle or something. I'm gonna go like this when it's funny, okay? How many of y'all heard of Cardi B? Raise your hand. Okay, thank you. That's good. Well, Cardi B said it best, but I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I am a regular, degular, schmegular girl from the Bronx. And you know what the Bronx is? The Bronx, New York? Okay, good. Is there anybody here from New York? Thank you. Thank you. BX. So let me tell you a little bit about who I am. I come from the Bronx. I come from a regular sort of working class family. I feel like it's good to underscore that because sometimes people have really terrible misconceptions about what the Bronx is. I once had a girl in college ask me, is that just where all the poor people live? I was like, yes. Yes, that's exactly what it is. But I kind of have what I call an ordinary, extraordinary story of survival. I grew up in the Bronx and with a single mother and a grandfather who was the center of my world for a long time. My mother never used the title feminist, but she certainly was a feminist in her own right. And she raised me kind of wrapped in Black feminist literature. And my grandfather, who was a Garveyite, and that means that he was a believer in the teachings of Marcus Mosiah Garvey, raised me to read a history book alongside the Bible to make sure I was really clear about who I was and where I stood in the world. And so at about 11 or 12 years old, my mother, who had this incredible library with all of these colorful books on it, allowed me finally to read a book by a woman named Maya Angelou. Yeah, and the book is called I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings. It's her first autobiography. My mother didn't know at the time, though, that I was already a survivor of sexual violence, twice. And so when I read Maya Angelou's book, and I read her story of also being a survivor of sexual violence, I found myself for the first time, a piece of myself. I never heard anybody talk about, think about, write about anything to do with sexual violence, particularly with young people. And so I thought, oh wow, there are 2 of us. Little did I know. That foray into that book really, people ask me all the time, how did you start this movement? And there's a clear date and time when I came up with the name Me Too, and we started doing the work. But really, if I peel back a layer, reading this book, and then subsequently hearing her voice for the first time were the seeds that started this movement. In high school, a couple of years after I first read the book, my high school honors English teacher played a recording of Dr. Angelou reading her poem, Phenomenal Woman. You all have heard this poem, right? Phenomenal Woman? Have you? Okay, good. Listen, take notes, look these things up when I finish. They will enrich your life. Well, anyway, I first heard her voice reading Phenomenal Woman, and it changed me. Because although I had read her book and I had read her poetry, I never actually heard her saying the words. I never actually heard her voice. And when I did, I was confused. Because up until then, she and I had a secret. She and I shared a secret that we both had survived and endured this thing. And what I thought she had been telling me through her work was, you have to pretend. You have to figure out how to show the world that you're not this person. But what her voice told me when I heard her reading that poem was that she believed that she was phenomenal. She sounded like she meant it. And I went home confused. And I got my journal out and I wrote a question at the top of the page of my journal before I wrote my entry. And really, this movement is entirely built on this one question. After listening to Dr. Angelou read about how phenomenal she was and how grand she was as a woman who had endured this kind of trauma that I knew and experienced, I wondered aloud and wrote in my page, how can a body that holds this kind of pain also hold joy? I was perplexed. I didn't understand it. I did not think joy was possible. I did not think healing was possible. I just thought I had to carry this thing, this burden that I didn't ask for the rest of my life and pretend that I had figured it out. But what Dr. Angelou's voice told me was that something else was possible. And so I literally started in that moment on a journey to try to figure that out. If she could heal, because what I heard in her voice was a healed person or a person who was in the process of healing. And if she could heal, was it possible for me? And if it was possible for me, was it possible for other people? Around the same time as I was making this discovery, I was also making another discovery. So I had all of this rich cultural upbringing from my mother and my grandfather, and I was grounded historically and culturally in who I was as a Black girl in America. But what they didn't give me was a tool or a mechanism. So they taught me how to recognize injustice when I saw it. But I didn't have a tool or mechanism to do anything about it. And an organization called the 21st Century Youth Leadership Movement found me right around the same time. And what 21st Century taught me was that I had power now. That I didn't have to wait to be an adult, that I didn't have to be trained in anything particular, that I had power to do something about the injustice I saw around me now. So while I was struggling with this question of, can I heal, I was also discovering this innate power that I had to do something about things that I saw that were wrong in the world. And for me, that led my life for the next couple of years. I went through college as an organizer, and I organized around everything from police brutality to economic injustice to politics, every type of issue. That was the beginning of my own healing process. But as I came through college, and I was always faced with young people, particularly young Black girls who had survived sexual violence just like I had, a question began to grow in my mind. The same question that I started with Dr. Angelou of, can a body that holds this much pain also hold joy? I started to wonder about for the young people that I was around. So I'd moved to Selma, Alabama. I'm from the Bronx, but 21st Century was founded in Alabama. And it was founded by veterans of the civil rights and human rights movements. And so I moved to Selma. How many of you've heard of Selma? At the very least, you've seen the movie, right? Yes? I know it's early, y'all, but help me out. Okay. So Selma, Alabama is known globally as this, the seat of the civil rights movement, where so many things happen, where the voting rights movement happened. But really, at the end of the day, it's a small southern town. There's 25,000 people. And Selma, just like so many other small southern towns in the United States, it was wrecked with poverty and lots of trauma. And so when I moved to Selma, and I continued to work with young people in that community, it became clear to me that my organizing skills and my need to heal needed to be married. I worked with 7th and 8th grade students in this little town, in the junior high school. That means that in a week's time, I saw possibly 100 to 125 7th and 8th grade black girls. They ranged in age from 12 to 14 years old. Very quickly after I started doing this work, it became clear that we had a problem. Because of those 100 to 125 girls, more than half, probably 75% of them, had already experienced sexual violence, and they were 12 and 13 and 14 years old. They would come to me with stories that they had normalized in their lives. Like I had a 7th grade student who was 13 years old with a 21-year-old boyfriend. And I had to try to figure out, how do I tell this baby that this is not a relationship, this is a crime? It was difficult. And I looked around in the community and there were no resources. I went to the guidance counselor in the school and she said, well, I don't know, let me see if I have something in a binder, or let me look up in a book. I went into the community, to the local rape crisis center and the people who were supposed to deal with sexual violence, and they turned me away and told me I had to go to the police first. There were no resources. And so I had been raised in this work with 2 mantras. 1, the personal is political. And 2, you have to take what you have to make what you need. And that was the one that stuck out the very most. You have to take what you have to make what you need. What I realized that I had was experience. Unfortunately, I had already experienced sexual violence. I had already embraced the idea that I was a survivor. That's what I had. I also had an insatiable desire for change. I had an insatiable desire to go out in the world and be the change that I wanted to see. The things that people had been telling me, that adults had been telling me for years. And what I needed was a tool. I needed a tool to start open dialogue about the realities of sexual violence in our community. And I needed a plan for interrupting it. I looked at these young people every day and realized that the trauma that they experienced had robbed them of hope. It had completely robbed them of hope to be different. And this was a time in my life when I was doing soul searching, and I was trying to be mindful, and I was trying to make my own life better. And I looked at these young people and realized that nobody spoke those things into this community. Nobody spoke hope and healing into this community. Nobody said to these young people, you are not the sum of the things that happen to you. And so I needed a way to do that. So my big idea in this little town, this small town, was the idea of empowerment through empathy. Literally, Me Too started as an exchange of empathy between 2 survivors. One of those survivors being me. I worked with these young people every day. They loved me. They knew I loved them. They trusted me. And so when I stood in front of a room and said, this thing happened to me too, I hear you. I see you. I believe you because I am you. It changed everything. It allowed young people to open up. It allowed them space to talk about this thing. And we started really small. We started in schools with a very basic concept of language. A lot of the young people I talked to would tell stories that they had normalized in their own mind, but that I knew were stories of sexual violence. But they didn't know how to explain them. Listen, I have a 20-year-old who would love for me to just say, almost 21-year-old. She's like, I'm 20 and 3/4. I'm like, you still can't have a drink. But I have a 20-year-old, and when my daughter was about maybe 2, she once got a really high fever. So I was a young mother. I rushed her to the hospital and make sure nothing was wrong. And she was fine. She was inquisitive. And so when we got home, she said, Mommy, why did I have to go to the doctor? And I said, well, because you had a fever. You were very sick. You had a fever. And she thought for a minute. She said, okay. And then for the next few weeks, anytime something happened to her, she would stub her toe and say, Mommy, I got a fever in my foot. Or, look, she'd get a scratch, say, I got a fever on my arm. And I would say, Kaya, that's not a fever, and explain to her exactly what it was. But in reality, she did that because she didn't have words to describe the pain. She didn't have words to actually tell me what she was feeling or what had happened to her. And that's what I saw every day with these young people. They didn't have language in a very basic way. And so we started off doing just that, giving them language to describe what happened to them, because what I knew inherently is that you can't heal a thing if you can't even define it. If you can't call it what it is, if you can't say plainly, this happened to me, then you don't even have an entry point to start healing. So we started doing that work, and it grew quickly. Other teachers asked us to come bring the work to their classrooms. Other schools asked us to come to their district. People asked us to come out and bring this thing that we were doing with the young people to them. And then we created a MySpace page. How many of y'all remember MySpace? I know y'all are tech people in here. Yes. Thank you for making me feel good. When I say that to college students, they always stare at me blankly like, is that like pre-Facebook? Like, yes, MySpace. And we learned 2 things really quickly. One, social media was getting ready to be the wave, right? It was the first time, besides those like weird chat rooms we all had in AOL, it was the first time when you could like talk to people around the country that you'd never met before. And we set up this MySpace page and explained what we were doing, and immediately people started reaching out to us saying, thank you for starting this. Can you bring this to our community? How can I be involved? And we were like, oh my gosh. The second thing we learned is that we were onto something. We were onto something big. And what we thought was going to be just for the young people in our community quickly became something that people needed around the country. This was in 2007, a full 10 years before Me Too went viral. We knew that we had something that people needed, but we were the only ones who believed in it at the time, who believed in it enough to keep going. And we continued to grow. Listen, we had no resources at the time. Not too unlike now, but we had very little resources. I used to call it the paycheck to paycheck movement, because my girlfriend and I who did it had different pay periods, so every Friday we would spend our money to buy something else we needed to do the work. And I'll tell you what, as we grew, and as hard as it was, there were 4 values, well, 3 values and 1 belief that kind of got us through. We had no funding. And when I say no funding, I mean we would send folders out to people around the country to teach them how to do the work that we were doing. And we wanted to look professional. We wanted to look like we were buttoned up and pulled together. So we would go into Staples, the local office supply place, and have long debates about which kind of folder to get, because one was $10 more than the other. Like, should we get the glossy folders or, trying to figure out which looked more professional. But it was tenacity that kept us going. There was something about this work that we knew had to happen. And so whether we could fund it from our pockets or using resources at our jobs after hours, whatever we had to do, we had to stick to it. And then, a few years later, once the ball got rolling and we got a little bit of funding in, we were approached by some people who did similar work. And they said to us, if you want to do this work and really take it far, you should join our work. You should join our work and do this with us. Let's fold you into what we're doing. And what they were doing was good work, but it wasn't our work. We had a very specific model and a very specific way that we did the work. And if we had have joined what they were doing, it would have lacked integrity. And so we said no. Even though it would have changed the trajectory of what we were doing, it would have given us more financial resources, it would have given us a larger platform, we had to say no. It just wasn't worth the integrity. And so we plodded along for some time, about 5 or 6 years, stopping and starting, depending on what the resources were and who needed us. And then October 2017 happened. I woke up one morning to a flurry of Twitter messages and Facebook messages saying a variety of, oh my God, congratulations, I see Me Too everywhere, and hey, is this you? I had no idea what people were talking about. I got up, I looked at my phone like everybody does in the morning, and I couldn't find it. I didn't know what people were talking about, because it hadn't really gotten viral yet. Well, within a few hours, my social media pages were flooded, and I was so confused. I didn't know how to react. I had so many emotions about it. I thought, the white people are gonna take my stuff away from me. That was my first thought. There was a really interesting thing that happened of seeing this thing that I had created for and by Black and brown girls spread to the whole world. Now, by this time, our work had spread. We had already started doing work with diverse communities. We were working with more than Black and brown girls, but it was never this diverse. And I watched it grow, panicked, trying to figure out how I was gonna save my work. All day long, I don't know how I'm gonna save my work. And then a really interesting thing happened. About 1 o'clock in the morning, I'm staring at the computer, watching the little hashtag go, scroll through my Twitter screen. And I randomly clicked on this woman's Twitter page. And when I clicked on the link that she had there, it opened up to a page that told her story. And it was a terrible story, like most are. And I read that story, and I sat up in my bed, and I cried. And then I said to myself, what are you doing, Tarana? All day long, I spent fretting about losing my work. And all day long, my work was happening right in front of me. Right there in front of me. And so I had to make a decision in that moment, because I'll tell you what, Black American women were fiercely defending me. They were online, they were telling people, this was started by Tarana Burke, you can't take this away from Tarana Burke. So I could have definitely had a fight on my hands. I could have spent the next few weeks talking about how I started this and it was mine and me. But I knew after reading that woman's story, in that moment, I had a decision to make. I had decided at 14 or 15 years old to dedicate my life to social justice and to service. And so the question became, are you gonna be in conflict? Or are you gonna be in service? And my values dictated that I had to be in service. And so the next day, I very quietly inserted myself, and actually the same day, very quietly inserted myself into the conversation. I took information and videos from the years that we had been doing this work. I put it online, and I said to people, I'm so excited to see people embracing Me Too and the Me Too movement. This whole thing started from a very simple idea called empowerment or empathy. This is how we do the work. This is what we mean by that. And within hours, the video that I posted explaining what Me Too was went viral. And people started reaching out to me saying, oh, you started this. Can you tell us more about it? Can you come talk on our television show? Can we interview you? What do you think about what's going on? Overnight. And that's because I stuck to the vision. I didn't try to change the work that we had done for the last decade to fit the moment. I used what we had done for the last decade to explain the vision of why the moment happened. Because it wasn't just two words. They were two words that resonated deeply with people, that made them feel seen and heard and believed. It gave them an opportunity to stand up and declare that they were not shamed for these things having happened to them. And so besides, at this point, the tenacity that got us there, the integrity that kept us there, it was the vision that grounded us. And the last thing is a belief. It's not as much of a value. But I do believe that grace is the reason why I'm still here. Some people call it luck. I call it grace. The fact that I'm able to represent both the origins of this movement and the future of this movement is really by the grace of God. I do believe in preparation. I do believe in vision and values. But I understand what grace looks like. Let me go back to vision for a minute. I said already that we started small and dreamed big with a clear vision. But what I learned this year, and it's been almost a year since Me Too went viral, what I've learned this year is that while your vision should stay the same, the tools that you use to get there can grow and expand and even change. And that's okay, as long as you stay true to your values. I started off this work very clearly centering Black girls. Our work was about Black and brown girls having an opportunity to heal, having hope spoken into their life. And what I learned very quickly, and in particular this year, is that I can center Black girls without, and include everybody else at the same time. It's not to the exclusion of anybody else. And in fact, Me Too is a tool that reaches far and wide. And because I am a Black girl in this world, I recognize that if I don't say it, if I don't say emphatically that this is for Black and brown girls, this is for disabled people, this is for queer people, if I don't say that, then they won't be pulled to the center. And so it's not to the exclusion of anybody else, it's to make sure that the inclusion actually happens. People often ask me, why do you always talk about Black girls? You shouldn't go to big white spaces and talk about Black girls. Why not? I bet you won't hear Black girls, Black girls, Black girls, Black girls. I bet you won't hear it that many times in the next 3 days. I just filled a quota for you, by the way. Thank you. Many of you started with a vision for something. And for many reasons, none that I'm judging, your vision may or may not have included a diversity of people. Our response to lack of diversity and inclusion, though, can't be just to check off a box, to fill the coffers. I had the occasion to meet this Fortune 500 CEO this summer, and we were at this very fancy thing, and he was regaling me with his stories of how, at this point in his company, he's just filling the coffers, that's his word, with women and people of color. And he was very proud of himself. He says, oh, you would love it. I'm just determined at this point. I'm just trying to get as many women in and many people of color in as possible. And he was quite shocked when I said, why? I said, well, because we have to. We have to do that, or else it will, we have to. And I said, what kind of values does your company have? And he went and ran down all of this stuff about the values of the company. And I was like, so here's the thing. You can fill the coffers of your company with all kind of people, but what if you get women who come in the door and close the door behind them? Then what? That's not helpful. It's not sustainable. What if you get people of color that don't believe that other people of color should be in the room because they want to be a special snowflake? It's not helpful. What if I had sat in my room that day and said, Me Too is only for us, and I'm going to spend the next few weeks and months fighting about that? It's not helpful. It's possible to diversify your vision. It's possible to diversify what you're doing and stick to your values. Both of those things can happen at the same time. I'm here on an international stage because I stayed true to my vision. And even as I expanded and diversified the tools that we use for achieving it, of course with integrity and tenacity, my vision aligns with my values. And I just want to note this. There's always a lot of values talk at conversations like this, right? In conferences like this. But everybody's values aren't always reflective of where they should be. And so I'd like to also insert a note here about values that says, while you should be true to them, you should also constantly interrogate them. I had to do the same thing at the moment that Me Too went viral. Why do I value these things? What do I value about them? It's not okay to just say, well, this is how I was raised, or this is what I always believe. We have to constantly interrogate our values and find out, how do they measure up with where society is moving? Do they put human dignity over a bottom line? Do they value humanity at all costs? Do they allow people to enjoy the freedom of physical and mental and spiritual autonomy? So don't just scream values. Make sure you are on the right track with your values. So Me Too is a global movement of survivors working to heal from the trauma of sexual violence while trying to interrupt the scourge of sexual violence. We believe healing is possible. We believe survivors are powerful and have answers. And we believe that we will win. What we've seen over the last year, it's funny, when it went viral and there was a whole big hoopla, people kept saying to me around 3 months in, you know there's gonna be a big backlash, right? You know there's gonna be a big backlash. The people are gonna come and they're gonna backlash against this. Yes. So we're here. We're in the midst of the backlash. Because what you hear now all the time when people talk about Me Too and why people say, oh, I'm so tired of hearing it, is because they think about it wrong. People think that we are a movement that's about taking down powerful men, about Hollywood actors, or about any number of things that you read in the media. But none of that is sustainable, and all of that is contrary to our vision. It's contrary to even the first tweet that went out, right? Even the first tweet that went out simply called for a declaration of people who had dealt with sexual harassment or sexual assault to say that Me Too. But from that very first tweet and from our very first seed planted back in 2006, we have arrived here to a place where this movement is being defined by the media and by the corporations. It's dangerous, by the way, to reduce what we've witnessed in the last year to simply mob justice. It's a disservice to the millions. Do you know that 12 million people engaged with the hashtag #MeToo in the first 24 hours on just Facebook alone? 12 million people raised their hands around the country, around the world, to say that they had experienced sexual violence. Every single one of those hashtags is a human being. And effectively, they still have their hands raised because what the media has done is pivoted away from them. And so we're now trading on the labor of survivors of sexual violence for salacious headlines about who the Me Too movement is going to take down next. And that's why I believe in grace, because I'm able to travel around the world now and talk about the real vision, the true vision of this movement, and to articulate what that vision is and what our values are. Again, if you didn't hear it, this is a global movement of survivors that are working to heal from the trauma of sexual violence while trying to interrupt the scourge of sexual violence. Anything else you hear is wrong. Anything else. I believe that our vision will carry us forward. I do. I see it changing, I see it happening. I meet people every day that validate that for me. I believe we will win because the vision is sound. One of the reasons why organizing and healing were married together was because I'm clear that you cannot ask people, I'm clear that survivors have solutions, right? You have to center the people who experience the pain. And the people who experience the pain are the most qualified to talk about how to get away from it. But you can't ask people to do that work without offering them a way to heal. So I won't ask people to go on the street and organize against sexual violence without giving them ways to heal from it. That's very simple. We get there through empathy. But also, I'm not invested in, and people take this wrong when I say this, but I need you to hear me. I'm not invested in seeing us win. I know we'll win. I'm clear we will win, but I don't have to see it happen. I'm more invested in planting the seeds to make it happen and leaving the space for the tools to expand. Does that make sense? I set up this vision, I have these values, I work towards it. I may never see us win. If you study the civil rights movement and listen to Dr. King, or the people around Dr. King more importantly, one of the things that they will say is, for instance, for Selma, he didn't want to go after voting rights. He didn't believe that we would get it. He didn't believe it was winnable. It was the young people in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who decided that voting rights was the next frontier. So they came to Selma in 1963, a full 2 years before the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, a full 2 years before Bloody Sunday and the March from Selma to Montgomery, all of the things that led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act. They came in 1963. To Mississippi and to Alabama, and they started working on voting rights. They got on the ground, and they started small, and they knocked on doors, and they tried to register people to vote, and they taught people to pass the voting test, and they were beaten and harassed by police. They were chased out of town, and they kept coming back. They laid the groundwork. And they believed what Dr. King said, which was that we won't see voting rights in our lifetime. But they worked like it was gonna happen anyway. Now, I'm not saying that sexual violence will end in the next 2 years, but I'm clear that it will end because we have a vision for it that makes it possible. And so what I am doing is working like hell to make sure I stay that course. I'm not invested in seeing the win. I'm invested in making sure that the next person who takes over this, I promise you, in 5 or 6 years, I'm looking for some 23-year-old unicorn to come along who can take the reins of this, who will be thinking about things that I never thought of, who believes in the vision but sees a different way forward. That's fine with me. I want that person to take over and take this to another level. I want her to take the seeds that were planted and the fruit that grew from those seeds and replant them. That's fine with me because I know the vision is sound. The tools will change, the people will change, but we will win. Thank you.
That was amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you. You want to come join me over here? That's for you. Oh, that was powerful. Thank you so much for sharing. I mean,
Everybody's running out the door.
not everyone's running out of the door.
Is this on?
Yeah, it is
Okay,
on.
yeah.
There's a few other things that are going on as well. Do you want a glass of water?
Oh,
Yeah.
maybe.
Maybe. All right, let's
Thank
get you a
you.
glass of water. Guys, some great questions coming up, including a question about Trump. We'll decide how we deal with that. But some really, really good questions come in. So slido.com, please, bits18. Thank you so much for sharing. There are two things that I often don't say at tech conferences that I think you embody.
Okay.
One is humility. I mean, wasn't that such a inspiring because of how humble, like sometimes you hear inspiring because of everything that's been accomplished, and for sure you've accomplished so much, but with such humility. So, first of all, thank you for that. And second, yes. And second, the other thing that's hardly ever mentioned, that's for you, but something that I hear a lot in church is grace of God. That's not a phrase that happens often at tech conferences.
I didn't think so.
So we're going to have to decipher what grace of God means after. Twitter's going crazy with lots of great quotes. I mean, so many nuggets in there. Slido is open, but there was one question that I saw you answer earlier, and I really liked your answer to it. I really liked the question as well. The journey started with something quite specific, and it has grown, and it is growing, and now you have a platform. And the question is, what is the next focal point that you think society should be, and how can you use your platform to keep expanding this and keep growing this? Where's next?
I get that question all the time about where's next, and I think that's the reason why I center on where we started.
Yeah.
Because that's really what's next. That point that I made about the millions of people whose hands are raised, really, there are so many people, and I think this is fascinating that something could be built off of the lives of millions of people, and we literally ignore their lives. And so what hasn't happened in the last year, unfortunately, as big as Me Too is resources have not been moved into the work of ending sexual violence. You would think that, I always make this comparison, but you would think that, imagine if tomorrow we woke up and there was a pandemic, 12 million people around the world caught a communicable disease, right?
Yep.
In 24 hours, 12 million people literally around the world had this disease. The world would stop.
Correct.
And it would be three questions. How did we get here? How do we stop it? And how do we make sure it never happens again? We haven't answered those questions. We haven't even broached those questions. Instead of journalists and media digging into, oh my God, the breadth and depth of sexual violence is far more far-reaching than we ever thought. Instead of that, they're saying, well, who's the movement going to take down next?
Correct.
Right? We know far more about Les Moonves's money and Harvey Weinstein's, whatever, than we do about the actual survivors. And so my focus is on them. My focus is on us. What has to happen next is that more resources have to flow into the work of ending sexual violence.
Correct.
And more resources have to flow into the work of helping people to heal. We're talking about one trauma. Sexual violence is just one kind of trauma, and there are many layers of trauma out in the world. But there's so many people affected by it who feel broken. And we want people who feel broken to act like they're whole, and we want them to work and play and live and be productive when they're feeling broken. And so we have to be about the business of making people feel whole again so that we can do this other work.
I love that. Thank you so much for that answer. I know that this is the top question that has been asked. And so remember that word grace, because this is not about political bashing, but people do want to know, so the question here,
I can't read that.
First, thank you, is what they said. And what are you doing now to combat Trump? And I guess the way they're diluting the message of #MeToo.
So, God, I have to take deep breaths when I talk about Trump. Yeah, deep cleansing breaths. I'm sure people are aware of what's happening in the news in the United States right now. I'm almost embarrassed to be in another country and having to answer questions about this clown who's running our country. Because it's like clown college. The one thing one of the things that makes me hopeful in this moment is that, in other movements around, throughout history in the United States, the movement itself was sort of undergirded by the government, right? In the civil rights movement, for instance, we did a lot of work on the ground so that we can move and get the Supreme Court to make decisions for the people. Or we had the president who signed over bills for the people.
Correct.
Or the Congress, we could do that, but we cannot depend in this moment on the Supreme Court or the Congress or the president for leadership in America. We're just in this precarious position. But what has happened is that it has caused the people to rise up again. And the way that we are dealing with Trump is that the people are pushing back, and we are literally defining the kind of leadership that we need and the kind of leadership that we demand. Right. And so Trump can say all the things he wants to about this movement, and he's actually, in an odd way, I despise the man, and I think that's probably clear, but in an odd way, he has become a teaching tool. He's become he makes it so clear, all of the stereotypes, all of the things that we say about this is the danger of thinking this way, he embodies that. And so when I say, in my speech, when I say, we cannot talk about the Me Too movement as a way to take down powerful men, and then he says, well, the Me Too movement is just out here taking down us powerful men. And I'm like, see? I told you. So, I guess if I'm going to be grateful that he's making it easier for me to explain to people why the work that we're doing is so important.
Okay. So you talked about the importance of government and how it would have helped if they were facilitating the conversation. What has been clear is that social media played a very important role. And so the next question that comes in is, how do you think #MeToo would have developed if it wasn't for social media?
Well, I can tell you, I was I was doing that work for 13 years, very slowly. And so what social media did, and this is again one of the things I learned in this year, prior to Me Too going viral, myself and the dozens of us who do this work around the country could never foresee a time where there could be a national or international sustained dialogue about sexual violence. It was very difficult to go into a room of even a 10% of what's in this room to talk about this as a topic. People did not want to talk about it. People felt a lot of shame about it. And so there was no entry point for discussion. And so what the social media did and the hashtag did was create this entry point for discussion because you couldn't ignore it. And it allowed space for somebody like me to come and say, okay, now that the space is opened up, let me tell you about this vision for changing this, right? Because people just couldn't hear it before. So in that way, social media is a gift and a curse. I always say that. But that way, it was very much a gift.
Absolutely. And I think something that's very apparent from your story is it was about the one girl and the one story and the importance of really believing and connecting, the word empathy that you used. Because a lot of people think movements require huge resources and social media and all of that, and those are helpful, but it was the groundwork, the foundational work that you've done with one, with two, with one, with two, with names of girls that you know. That's how it's built.
And that's a good point that you made. I think one of the challenges of being in the era of social media and like pop culture and what it is, being what it is that people don't feel valid unless what they do is big. So I have people saying to me all the time, either they write me and say, I want to start a movement. Like, can you help me start a movement? And I'm like, no, that's not. Like, what is that built on? What is it based on, right? Yeah. And the other thing is that people say, I really want to tell my story. I really want to say Me Too, but I don't feel ready to put it out there yet. And I always say, don't. You don't have to be validated by likes. You don't have to, telling your story is the first step into healing, but that can be telling it to your best friend. It could be writing it in your journal. And so I'm hoping that we can move away from this idea that in order for the bright idea you have, or the thing that you want to spark to be valid, that it has to be huge. It has to hit with a splash. I can do more with 10 really dedicated, hardworking people who have the same vision and values that I have than I can with going on the internet every day trying to recruit people through likes and hashtags.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is why I always say 4 words to people. Start now, start simple.
That's right.
And it's what you did when that girl told you the story.
That's right.
It was that moment. And then you started simple. Just
Yeah.
like, let me listen.
Yeah.
Let me be here.
We started with language.
Yeah.
Right? I would literally go into a classroom and put up on the board words and ideas and pictures of celebrities who had also experienced sexual violence. And we just go through and give them definitions and allow space to talk, very simply. And we're actually still doing that. Right? It's just on a bigger platform.
So the question that comes in here is, what's your advice for women who work in a male-dominated environment? This is actually a great representation in this particular audience, but of course, you've done tech conferences, I do tech conferences, and it can be lopsided, and also in the workspace. So what is your advice to women?
Well, I mean, so I have a lot of advice.
Go on, give us a list, hit us.
But I mean, it would depend is what I'm saying, like what specifically. I think that, and I've done a few more conferences this year than I've ever done before, and this is clearly always a question that comes up. So one, I think that women in tech and women in corporations can take advantage of this moment in really positive ways. So there's this really, I don't have the right word for it, but except for dumb or lopsided thinking that's happening that says, oh, well, we can't hire women now. So I don't have to deal with Me Too. I just won't hire any women, or I won't promote women, or I won't have meetings with women and that kind of thing. I think that what this moment does is present an opportunity for women in the corporate world to create dialogue in the spaces that they're working about the realities of what it is to work there, right? The decisions that we have to make. So if you work in a space where they allow, especially in a lot of like, these like upstarts and like Silicon Valley kind of places, these big companies, like I spoke at Hulu, and Hulu has this really great open policy where they come and they talk about it, they have forums and stuff like that. If you have something like that at your job, or you have the space to create it, this is the time to have a real conversation. Like you can walk away from this conference and say, I heard the woman who started Me Too speak about it, and she said something totally different. I'd love to have a conversation about that. Or have a dialogue where the women in the company, without, this is not about attacking men, right? Without setting up a space where men feel attacked, where they can say, this is my reality here. These are the 5 decisions I have to make every day when I come to work that you don't think about. I have to think about what I wear. More, not just the tie that I wear, is it a power tie or not, right? But I have to think about, is this gonna give off this kind of connotation? Is this gonna make so-and-so wanna harass me? Is this gonna make so-and-so think that I'm, we have a set of decisions that we go through every day that men are oblivious to.
Yeah.
And it's a burden. And so I think that one big piece of advice that I would say is to start creating that dialogue. The other thing, and this is just a quick aside, is that so many women I meet, and this is men too actually, so many women in particular I meet don't know the sexual harassment policy at their job. It's really interesting to me. They know they have it. They know it exists, but they don't actually know what it says. They haven't read it, they haven't read through it, they don't know the details of it. And so I would advise women, grab 2 or 3 of your girlfriends for coffee, at lunch, during a break, sit down with that handbook and go through and look at the sexual harassment policy and actually look at all the gendered policies and compare what the book says, what the policy says, to your lived experience in that space. And think about, is there a policy here that would cover things that you've experienced already, or that you know other people have experienced? Are there gaps in the policy? Is there something missing that you know is crucial to being fair and balanced for all the people at work? And when you find those gaps, this is what I advise people who are like, I don't know where to start, I don't know what to do. That's a place to start. Look for those gaps and then bring it up and say, hey, a few of us were reading the sexual harassment policy, and I really think we need to look at it again. Come to the people who make the decisions with clear, delineated lists of things that could be added to it or should be taken away. Those are just 2 things I think that women can do in this moment while we have this attention.
That's really good, and I like the suggestions you gave were on the side of positivity, because the next question that's coming in here is, how do you let positivity speak louder than negativity, specifically around people who are tired of hearing of this topic?
So I started off by saying this. People, I get it all the time. Oh my God, I'm so tired of hearing about it. But I think that's because people are hearing about it from one perspective.
Okay.
And so there's very little that I have to be, no, actually there's a lot that I could be negative about, but there's very little that propels me to be negative, because what we're doing inherently is not negative, right? And so the positivity of it, particularly in this kind of space, you're talking about diversity and inclusion. The positivity of it is that this is a thing that can change the trajectory of so many companies, so many startups and things like that. If you really embrace this moment, imagine if you're the company that gets ahead of Me Too. If you're the company that takes this moment, doesn't wait until somebody's caught doing something or doesn't wait until there's a complaint, but actually takes the time to get ahead of it and say, let's dig into what's happening here and see how we measure up, and see if let's question the women and men in the company, or the people across the gender spectrum in this country and this company, and see how we can change that. That puts you ahead of the curve. Right? So there's lots of ways to talk about this from a positive perspective. There's nothing negative about inclusion. There's nothing negative, because at the end of the day, we're talking about making your environment less vulnerable to sexual violence. Everything about that is positive.
Yes.
Right? At the end of the day, we're talking about valuing human dignity over a bottom line. There's nothing inherently negative about that. Everything about that is positive. Regardless if your company is a tech company, if you're corporate, if you're Fortune 500, you have human beings who are pushing that work forward. You should want to value the dignity of the people who work for you, even if it's just to get better work, right? Pretend. Right? But even if it's just to get a better product, when you value human dignity, you get people who want to be more productive. And so you cannot talk about diversity and inclusion without talking about protection and safety, because it's inherent in that. You want to diversify, like that corporate person I was talking about. You want to get more women in. You want to get more people of color in. When they get there, will they feel safe? Will they feel protected? All of that is positive. All of that is working towards making a better company, because you have better people who want to do better work.
I was reading a piece about you, and you were talking about self-esteem versus self-worth, and just making people feel valuable.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly what you're talking about there. There's a question that's coming in here that says that sexual violence goes beyond gender.
Absolutely.
What are your views regarding children that are being abused, and how can we solve this inclusively?
I mean, my work started with children. I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse, and we started with children who were being abused. And so I think I would love for us to change the way we think about the spectrum of sexual violence in general. In fact, I think that we won't really move the needle significantly around this until we have comprehensive sex education in our schools. And one of the ways that we can help start to do the work of ending child sexual abuse is about taking the shame away from young people, right? So many children feel complicit in their own abuse, which means that because we set them up with a bunch of guidelines and rules and regulations to follow, right? We raise our children and we say, don't let anybody touch your private parts, and don't go away with strangers, and don't. But what we rarely say is, if any of that happens, it's not your fault, right? If any of that happens, it's always the adult's fault. If somebody threatens you or tries to make any of these things happen, you are not to blame. You can come to me. And even then, when we tell our children to come to us, we say, you come to me and tell me if somebody did something to you, I'll kill them, right? If somebody touches you, that's scary for children. Yeah. And so we have to look at the breadth of child sexual abuse and what effect it has on children, and we have to take our children out of that fight. We also have to raise our children to be with vigilance over fear, right? And that's a longer sort of conversation, but that's not about gender or anything at all either. This is about safety and protection again. It really comes down to that in a lot of ways.
I like that so much of what you're talking about is how to have healthy dialogue and conversation. And that is across so many barriers, which is why we're talking about diversity, because it's even about two people from two different cultures talking to each other, not just to gender or to age or it's socioeconomic. There's so many divides, and yet healthy dialogue breaks those divides.
We underestimate dialogue. Dialogue is where everything starts. And it's not just, oh, let's just have a little chit chat. I'm talking about this dialogue has to be in our schools, it has to be in our companies, it has to be in our communities. This is more than just dialogue in your living room with your friends, which is also helpful. But we have to have bigger conversations because there's a lot of nuance to this.
Yes.
Right? It's very much not black and white. And so in order to dig into the nuances, we have to unpack it. We have to sit down and have real conversations that unpack the reality of it, because if we don't get to the root cause, knocking off individual bad doers, right, the individual bad actors that we're seeing in the paper, that's not going to stop sexual violence at all. It puts a Band-Aid on it. It gives cover to the company that gave them cover for years, right?
Correct. Yeah.
And then we still stuck with the same thing. There's some new bad actor that's being groomed right now while that other one is being sent off. And so we have to have the dialogue, because the dialogue gets us to the heart of the problem, and then we can uproot that and start working on changing that thing.
Amazing. On that note, I want to say thank you so much.
Thank you.
And here's to some really good dialogue for the rest of the conference. We're going to take an energy break because there's a lot of material you just soaked in. We'll see you back at 3 o'clock. Let's give Tarana Burke a hand.
Thank you.